The pacts. How many times have we not heard about them? About people who with agreements get an infinity of economic resources or of any kind. People at their disposal to do some work or even people at their mercy. Which is different from what was mentioned earlier. Of all is what can be achieved supposedly with these agreements with entities that precisely, they have no good intentions, and much less, they are altruistic. Although it has never been able to prove to certain science that these pacts are real, there are a lot of testimonies, stories, legends, sayings of everything, what tells us about it and gives us a panorama in favor of the effectiveness of these agreements. And precisely, a legend about one of these pacts is what brings us together here today. Year 1650, full 17th century. Don Bartolo Zadanet, or better known in those times as El Segoviano, was a Spanish who had arrived to the city of Querétaro in company of his sister Elvira. Its home is a house located on the current Luis Pasteur Street and a few steps from what is today the Palacio de Gobierno. This house was also occupied and continues as a function of the State Public Education Secretariat. Being the 17th century in Mexico, times in which the vice-regents were in power and were those times of the New Spain, so the social classes were more than defined, marked or distinguished from each other. You know, the plebeians and the nobility, Spaniards, mestizos, Creoles, indigenous, colored, etc. And what can I say about slavery? The beautiful carved dresses of that style of the time were relishing next to the prominent flight crinolines that women of the high aristocracy wore. Men wore those huge hats, tricolored trousers and, as in some places we have seen, those blonde and curly wigs. This small description is only to give an image of all that atmosphere of the time. It is said that in those times, Don Bartolo was always a person with a life of the most relaxed, without haste, with a total relief, all at his disposal and all those things that people of the high society could have. On top of that, he was a youth who never stopped radiating along with a beauty that characterized him, and who seemed that years did not charge him any bill, for he always remained with that graceful beauty. But many always assured that the facade of that person in the form of physical perfection only served to cover how bad a person he was inside. A bad-hearted person, as they used to refer to. A total contrast between what was inside and what was outside. Because, they say, that Don Bartolo had the reputation of being a usurer with a low moral, and that whoever had a debt with him ended up paying very high interests, and that they, not being able to pay off any of their debts pending with Don Bartolo, far from having any extension, ended up losing forever any of the goods that had been left to him as a guarantee. And of course, they became property of the Segovian. They tell, between voices from the streets of that Querétaro, that Don Bartolo maintained relations with the type that, you may imagine, with his sister Elvira, of whom they also assure, he was deeply and lostly in love. A fact which was never proven, but it was always said. And to be certain of this, Don Bartolo always tried to cover this fact, because another of the facades that showed the public eye was that he was a very good believer, a person very attached to God. Because there was no mass that was lost during each Sunday, or religious event that did not attend or did not help. You know, a whole man made and right by God. But, an aspect of which he never took his eyes off or his finger off the ring was his abundant wealth, which people assured grew more and more. And was far from wanting to stop. And this was something that could not be hidden or concealed, for he constantly acquired properties, such as lands, houses, or installed businesses without the money being a problem, and among all that represented the figure of that man, there was always a special date for him in his life. Being his birthday, the annual date to destroy all kinds of luxuries, pleasures and parties. Being, of course, a meeting place for the people of the highest social classes, the most wealthy and the nobility of the city, who, of course, shared this event in equal conditions with Don Bartolo. But, in each of his celebrations, this man always gave a specific phrase and date, which exclaimed, "I give for the lady of my sister, for my soul," and for May 20th, 1701. Of course, the attendants of those events never understood the reason for that date mentioned. Well, Mr. Bartolo, apart from never commenting on what he was referring to, those celebrations were on a date very far from the mentioned one, which began in the year 1651, so it was not close. And they say that between the night of the 19th on his birthday, on May 20th, some woman of the servants always disappeared in strange circumstances, and she never was seen again. And this happened every year. May 20th, 1701. Finally, that date so exclaimed and to which it was worthy of a toast during each year, finally arrived. But it did not come alone, but came accompanied by an incident of the most peculiar. It was precisely when the bells sounded that announced the midnight of that city. That almost deafening rumble was perceived by many people, if not all, throughout the city, and, of course, that it took out of the dream to all those who slept pleasantly that night, the looks of the people peering from the doors of their houses, the windows, balconies, in the street. Everyone was looking for some kind of response to that thunderous sound, to realize the color so curious of the sky that painted that night, being a combination between red and purple, the tones that featured that visual spectacle, accompanied by a full moon perfect that lit each of those streets. During that night, no one could get an answer to that, so they simply decided to sleep, and at that time it seemed that the sunrise would never come again. The next day, when the first rays of the sun arrived, everything returned to its routine, in which the neighbors near Don Bartolo's house noticed instantly that Mrs. Elvira had not gone out to walk around in the morning, to the businesses, markets and everywhere where they were used to seeing her, and they also noticed the most peaceful thing about Don Bartolo's house. There was no movement as usual. In fact, it was totally the opposite, because that property seemed to be completely abandoned. So one of the neighbors closest to Mr. Segoviano and his sister notified the authorities to request to enter the house and verify that everything was in order. I suppose that because of the high society of those people, it was that they heard that call almost instantly, so they opened that huge wooden gate and entered their house, perceiving instantly an overwhelming silence. But the house was completely in order. The entire construction was searched in search of the owners to verify if they were well. And when they arrived at Don Bartolo's room, that scene was the one that paralyzed more than one spectator. The gazes were directed towards the foot of the bed, where the lifeless body of Elvira was found, with some marks on the neck that counted for itself that he had died of strangulation, and an expression on his face that communicated to the spectators' gazes that in those last moments of life, fear and terror had completely taken over him. And on the roof of that room was Don Bartolo's carbonized body, accompanied by light bulbs that denoted burns that, precisely, they were not light. Seeing all this, they instantly called a priest named Marmolejo, who assured that the Segovian was possessed by the forces of the being of darkness, to which he decided at that moment to perform an exorcism there. Act that, they assure, lasted several hours. Between that fight between light and darkness, they comment that in the process, voices, screams, laments and growls came out of that body that was glued to the ceiling. And they say that after fighting for several hours, as previously commented, that priest managed to take those dark forces off the body of Don Bartolo, which, when they came out, took the form of a black whirlwind that flew out through the window. And then, that lifeless body, now almost completely carbonized, finally fell from the ceiling, and one of the completely stiff hands was holding a piece of wood very tightly, which said, "Punished by hypocrite, murderer and thief." And in his wardrobe they found black-colored documents with accentuated and very beautiful white writings that evidenced a kind of agreement between Don Bartolo and those forces of the darkest in which they saw, who had promised to give his soul for the modest price of all the riches he had obtained in an unbridled way, pleasures of all kinds possible and that physical beauty that he never lost, this for 50 years. And the date of fulfillment of that deadline was May 20th, 1701. So, those gifts in honor of that day finally took shape and gave answers. In that house, some people who lived there for a while, assured to have experienced paranormal events, themselves, which forced them to leave the place.